The rain fell in heavy sheets across the wooden platform of Idaho City Station, and Florence Hartley stood alone beneath it, her traveling dress soaked through to her skin, watching the last wagon disappear into the muddy streets as darkness settled over the Idaho territory like a shroud. She had been waiting for 3 hours, clutching the crumpled letter in her gloved hand, until the ink had begun to run, the words blurring into meaningless smears that matched the tears she refused to let fall. The year was 1878, and she had traveled 2,000 miles from Boston to marry a man she had never met, only to find herself abandoned on a rain-swept platform with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a heart that was beginning to understand what true loneliness felt like. The station master had left an hour ago, tipping his hat apologetically as he locked the small office behind him, muttering something about the weather and how some men just were not reliable. Florence had nodded, maintaining the dignified composure her mother had drilled into her since childhood. But inside, she felt herself crumbling like the sodden paper in her hand. The letter from Kenneth Murphy had been so full of promise, describing his ranch in the foothills, the life they would build together, the family they would raise. He had sent money for her passage and a tintype photograph that showed a serious-looking man with dark hair and steady eyes. She had believed every word, had packed up her entire life and said goodbye to everything she knew, certain that she was heading toward something better than the suffocating confines of Boston society and the endless parade of suitable men who saw her as nothing more than a decorative addition to their established lives. Now she wondered if she had made the worst mistake of her 22 years. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and the temperature was dropping as night claimed the mountains surrounding the mining town. Florence pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, knowing it did nothing against the cold that had settled deep in her bones. She should find a hotel, should use what little money she had left to secure a room for the night, but something kept her rooted to that platform. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was the desperate hope that Kenneth Murphy would still come, that there was some reasonable explanation for his absence. The sound of hoofbeats on muddy ground cut through the steady drumming of rain, and Florence's heart leaped before she could stop herself. She turned toward the sound, watching as a figure on horseback emerged from the darkness, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. The rider was tall in the saddle, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shed water like a roof, and as he drew closer she could make out more details. The dark oilskin coat, the powerful chestnut horse beneath him, the way he sat with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life on horseback. He reined in at the platform with a spray of mud and water, and Florence found herself looking up into a face that bore little resemblance to the tintype she had studied for months. This man was younger than she had expected, perhaps 27 or 28, with strong features that were currently twisted with concern. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat as he swung down from the saddle with fluid grace, his boots splashing in the puddles that had formed across the wooden planks. "Miss Hartley." His voice was rough with what sounded like genuine distress, and Florence felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "I am Florence Hartley," she said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the trembling that had taken hold of her entire body. "I assume you are not Kenneth Murphy, given that you bear no resemblance to the photograph I received." The man removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair plastered to his skull by the rain. His eyes, she noticed, were a striking shade of blue-gray that seemed to catch what little light remained. "I am Kenneth Murphy, Miss Hartley. That photograph was taken 8 years ago, back when I was working the silver mines in Nevada. I should have sent a more recent one, but I did not think it mattered much." "What matters?" Florence said, feeling anger rise up to replace the cold fear that had been her companion for the past 3 hours, "is that you left me standing in the rain for half the evening. The station master has gone home. Everyone has gone home. I have been standing here alone, wondering if I had crossed an entire continent to be abandoned by a man who could not even be bothered to meet me at the appointed time." Kenneth flinched as though she had struck him, and she saw genuine remorse cross his features. "I know. Lord, Miss Hartley, I know, and I cannot tell you how sorry I am. One of my mares got tangled in barbed wire this afternoon, cut herself up bad, and by the time I got her free and stitched up, I realized I was going to be late. I rode hard as I could, but the rain slowed everything down. I know there is no excuse good enough for leaving you here like this." Florence wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold onto that righteous fury, because it was warmer than the cold disappointment that threatened to overwhelm her, but something in his voice made her pause. He looked genuinely stricken, and there was mud and what might have been blood on his coat sleeves. "The horse," she heard herself say. "Is she all right? She will be, thanks to some quick work and a lot of luck. But that does not change the fact that I left you standing here in this miserable weather." Kenneth stepped closer, and Florence caught the scent of horse and leather and rain. "Please, let me make this right. Let me take you home, get you warm and dry. We can talk about everything else once you are not freezing to death on this platform." The practical part of Florence's mind that had gotten her through the loss of her father, through her mother's subsequent decline, through the difficult decision to leave everything behind and head west, took control. She was cold and wet and exhausted, and standing here arguing was not going to improve any of those conditions. "Very well," she said, "though I expect a more thorough explanation once we reach your ranch. You will have it, I promise." Kenneth moved to pick up her carpet bag, and Florence noticed the way he handled it carefully, as though it contained something precious rather than just her meager belongings. He secured it behind his saddle, then turned back to her. "I am afraid we will have to ride double. I did not bring the wagon because I thought I could make better time on horseback. Another mistake to add to today's collection." Florence had never ridden double with a man in her life, but she nodded, recognizing that modesty was a luxury she could not afford at the moment. Kenneth mounted first, then reached down to help her up. His hand was strong and warm even through her wet glove, and she felt a strange jolt as his fingers closed around hers. He pulled her up with surprising ease, settling her sideways in front of him so she would not have to ride astride in her dress. His arm came around her waist, solid and secure, and Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold. "Hold on," Kenneth said, his voice close to her ear, and then they were moving. The horse responded to his commands as though they shared one mind, picking its way carefully through the muddy streets of Idaho City. The town was quiet at this hour, most of the residents having retreated indoors away from the weather. Lamplight glowed in windows, offering tantalizing glimpses of warmth and dry comfort that made Florence's current state feel even more miserable. They rode in silence through the town and out onto a road that climbed steadily into the foothills. The rain continued its relentless assault, and Florence found herself pressing back against Kenneth's solid warmth without quite meaning to. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his body moved with the horse's gait, the careful way he held her as though she might break. It was strangely intimate, this forced closeness, and Florence did not quite know what to make of it or the way her heart had begun to beat faster. "It is about another 20 minutes, Kenneth said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the rain. "The ranch sits in a valley with good water and decent grazing. The house is not much, but it is solid and it keeps the weather out." "I am sure it will be fine," Florence replied, though truthfully she had no idea what to expect. Kenneth's letters had described a working ranch with cattle and horses, but he had been vague on the details of the house itself. She had imagined everything from a grand homestead to a simple cabin, and she suspected the reality would fall somewhere in between. The road narrowed as they climbed, becoming little more than a track through the darkness. Florence could hear water running somewhere nearby, probably a creek swollen by the rain, and the wind carried the scent of pine and wet earth. Despite everything, despite her anger and disappointment and bone-deep exhaustion, she felt a small spark of something that might have been excitement. This was so different from Boston, from the cobblestone streets and brick buildings and carefully manicured parks. This was wild and raw and real in a way that her old life had never been. Kenneth guided the horse around a bend, and suddenly there were lights ahead. The house materialized out of the darkness like something from a dream, larger than Florence had expected but still modest by Boston standards. It was a two-story structure with a wide front porch, built from logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. Lamplight glowed in several windows, and smoke rose from a stone chimney despite the rain. Behind the house she could make out the shapes of other buildings. A barn, a stable, what might have been a bunkhouse. "Home," Kenneth said simply, and there was something in his voice that made Florence turn her head to look at him. He was staring at the house with an expression she could not quite read, something tender and proud and almost vulnerable. This place mattered to him, she realized. It was not just property or an investment. It was something he had built with his own hands and sweat, something that represented everything he had worked for. He rode right up to the porch steps before dismounting, then reached up to help Florence down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, stiff and cold from the ride, and Kenneth's hands steadied her with gentle firmness. "Easy now. You have been through enough tonight without adding a fall to the list." The front door opened before they could reach it, and a woman appeared in the doorway. She was older, perhaps in her 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a face that suggested both kindness and no-nonsense practicality. Her eyes widened when she saw Florence's bedraggled state. "Sweet mercy, Kenneth Murphy, what have you done to this poor girl?" "Got there too late, Mrs. Patterson," Kenneth said, ushering Florence into the warmth of the house. "This is Miss Florence Hartley, my intended. Miss Hartley, this is Mrs. Patterson. She is the closest neighbor and has been kind enough to help me prepare the house for your arrival." Mrs. Patterson made a tusking sound that reminded Florence of her childhood nurse. "Well, she cannot stay in those wet things another minute. Come with me, dear. We will get you warm and dry, and then we can worry about everything else." Florence found herself swept along by Mrs. Patterson's capable efficiency, led through the main room of the house and up a narrow staircase to a bedroom that had clearly been prepared with care. A fire burned in the small hearth, and the bed was made up with what looked like a new quilt in shades of blue and cream. Clean towels sat on a washstand next to a basin and pitcher, and someone had even placed a vase of wildflowers on the dresser, though they were wilting slightly from the heat of the fire. "Kenneth has been working himself half to death getting ready for you, Mrs. Patterson said as she helped Florence out of her soaked dress. "Had me and my husband over here every day for the past week, making sure everything was just right. He has been as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Despite everything, Florence felt a smile tug at her lips. The image of Kenneth Murphy, who had seemed so confident on horseback, being nervous about her arrival was oddly endearing. Mrs. Patterson wrapped her in a warm towel and then produced a nightgown from the dresser, simple but clean and soft. "This should fit well enough for tonight. Tomorrow we can see about getting your things dried and pressed." "Thank you," Florence said and meant it. The kindness of this stranger was almost overwhelming after the loneliness of the station platform. "You have been very generous." "Nonsense. We look after our own out here, and you are one of us now." Mrs. Patterson helped her into the nightgown and a thick robe that must have belonged to Kenneth, then guided her to sit by the fire. She produced a comb and began working through Florence's wet hair with gentle hands. "I know this has not been the welcome you hoped for, but Kenneth is a good man. Best man I know, truth be told. He would never have left you waiting on purpose." Florence closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and Mrs. Patterson's ministrations begin to thaw the cold that had settled in her core. He said something about a horse. Knows his animals better than most people know their own families. Probably saved that mare's life today, though it meant disappointing you. That would have torn him up inside. Mrs. Patterson finished with Florence's hair and began braiding it loosely. "There. Now you look almost human again. Are you hungry? I left a pot of stew on the stove and there is fresh bread." Florence's stomach chose that moment to remind her that she had not eaten since morning, when the train had stopped briefly in a small town whose name she could not remember. "I am starving, actually." "Good. A woman with an appetite is a woman who will survive out here." Mrs. Patterson helped her to her feet and handed her a pair of thick socks. "Put these on. The floors can be cold even with the fire going." They went back downstairs, where Kenneth was feeding wood into the large stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room. He had removed his wet coat and hat, and Florence could see that he was indeed younger than his letters had suggested, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscled build of a man who worked hard for his living. He looked up as they entered, and Florence saw relief flood his features when he saw her dry and warm. "You look much better," he said, straightening. "I am glad." Mrs. Patterson bustled past him toward the kitchen area, which occupied one end of the large room. "Sit down, both of you. You need hot food, and then this young lady needs rest. The two of you can sort out your business in the morning when you are both thinking clearly." Kenneth pulled out a chair at the large wooden table, and Florence sat, very aware that she was wearing his robe and nothing else but a nightgown and borrowed socks. It was the most intimate situation she had ever been in with a man who was not family, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks again. Kenneth took a seat across from her, maintaining a respectful distance, and Florence appreciated the consideration even as part of her wondered what it said about their future together that they could barely look at each other. Mrs. Patterson set bowls of rich, fragrant stew in front of them, along with thick slices of bread and butter. Florence ate with single-minded focus, discovering that she was even hungrier than she had realized. The stew was delicious, full of tender beef and vegetables, and the bread was still slightly warm. Across from her, Kenneth ate with the same quiet efficiency, and Florence found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking. He was handsome in a rugged way that was entirely different from the refined men of Boston society. There was nothing soft about him, nothing that suggested easy living or inherited wealth. This was a man who had built his life from scratch, who worked with his hands and knew the value of every dollar. His letters had hinted at his history, the years spent mining silver in Nevada before he had saved enough to buy this land and start his ranch. But seeing him in person made those stories real in a way they had not been before. "I want to explain," Kenneth said suddenly, setting down his spoon and meeting her eyes. "Not to excuse what happened, but so you understand. I know you crossed half the country to be here, and you deserved better than to be left standing in the rain like some unwanted package." Florence set down her own spoon, giving him her full attention. Mrs. Patterson had discreetly moved to the other end of the room, busying herself with cleaning up the kitchen. That mare is special, Kenneth continued, his voice low and serious. Not just because she is valuable, though she is. She belonged to my brother. He died 2 years ago, got sick with pneumonia and was gone before I could even get back to see him one last time. That horse is one of the few things I have left of Thomas, and when I saw her tangled in that wire, bleeding and terrified, I just reacted. I did not think about the time or about you waiting or about anything except saving her. Florence felt something shift inside her chest. I am sorry about your brother. He would have liked you, I think. Thomas always said I needed someone with sense and spirit, someone who would not put up with my stubborn ways. Kenneth smiled slightly, and Florence was struck by how it transformed his face, softening the hard edges and revealing the man behind the guarded expression. He would have given me hell for leaving you at that station. He would have been right to do so, Florence said, but her voice was gentle now, the anger from earlier dissolving in the face of his honest explanation. Though I understand why you did it. If the situation were reversed, if I had something precious from someone I had lost, I would have done the same. Kenneth looked at her as though she had surprised him, and Florence held his gaze, refusing to look away. This was the man she had agreed to marry, sight unseen. This was the man she would build a life with, assuming they both still wanted to go through with the arrangement. The circumstances of their meeting had been less than ideal, but there was something solid about Kenneth Murphy, something that made her think her instincts had been right when she had answered his advertisement. "So what happens now?" Florence asked. "We are strangers who agreed to marry based on letters and a photograph that turned out to be 8 years old. We have had possibly the worst first meeting in the history of first meetings. Where do we go from here?" Kenneth leaned back in his chair, considering her question with the same seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "I think we should take some time. You have been through a lot today, and you deserve a chance to see the ranch, to get to know me as I actually am rather than as I presented myself in letters. If you decide this is not what you want, I will pay for your passage back to Boston. No questions asked, no hard feelings." It was a generous offer, more generous than Florence had any right to expect, and it told her something important about the man across from her. He was not trying to trap her or hold her to an agreement made from thousands of miles away. He was giving her a choice, a real choice, and that meant more than he probably realized. "I appreciate that," Florence said carefully, "though I should tell you that Boston holds very little for me now. My father died 3 years ago, my mother followed him within the year, and the life they wanted for me was never something I wanted for myself. I answered your advertisement because I was looking for something different, something real. I am not the type to run at the first obstacle." "Good," Kenneth said, and there was approval in his voice that made Florence sit a little straighter. "Because life out here is full of obstacles. The work is hard, the weather can be brutal, and the nearest real town is Idaho City, which is not exactly Boston." "I am aware," Florence said dryly. "I did research the Idaho territory before agreeing to come here. I know what I am getting into, or at least I have a reasonable idea." Mrs. Patterson returned to the table, wiping her hands on her apron. "That is my cue to head home before my husband sends out a search party. Miss Hartley, it was a pleasure to meet you, and I hope we will be seeing much more of each other. Kenneth, try not to make any more mistakes tonight, all right? This poor girl has had enough excitement for one day." Kenneth walked Mrs. Patterson to the door, and Florence heard them speaking in low voices on the porch before the older woman departed. When Kenneth returned, he looked uncomfortable, and Florence realized with a start that he was probably as uncertain about this situation as she was. "The bedroom upstairs is yours," Kenneth said, not quite meeting her eyes. I will sleep down here on the couch until we are properly married. Mrs. Patterson made sure everything was set up for you, and if you need anything during the night, just call out." Florence nodded, appreciating his consideration for her reputation and comfort. "Thank you. For the room, for the food, for coming to get me even though you were late. I know today did not go as planned, but I am grateful to be here rather than still standing on that platform." "You will never have to stand alone in the rain again," Kenneth said, and there was something almost fierce in his voice, a promise that went deeper than simple words. "I swear that to you, Florence Hartley. Whatever else happens between us, I will always show up. I will always be there." Florence felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. It had been so long since anyone had promised her anything, so long since she had felt like she mattered to someone. "I believe you," she whispered. They stood there for a long moment, strangers bound together by an agreement made through letters and hope, and Florence felt the first real flutter of possibility in her chest. Maybe this would work. Maybe she had not made a terrible mistake after all. She said goodnight and climbed the stairs to her new bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the room was perfectly warm. Florence removed the borrowed robe and climbed into the bed, which was softer than she had expected and smelled faintly of lavender. She could hear Kenneth moving around downstairs, banking the fire and checking the doors, and the domestic sounds were oddly comforting. She thought about the day, about her anger and fear and disappointment, about the way Kenneth had looked at her across the table, about the promise he had made. Tomorrow she would see the ranch in daylight, would begin to understand what her new life would look like, but tonight she was warm and safe and no longer alone. It was enough for now. Florence closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under, dreaming of rain and strong hands, and a voice that promised she would never have to stand alone again. Morning arrived with weak sunlight filtering through the bedroom window and the smell of coffee drifting up from downstairs. Florence woke slowly, disoriented for a moment before memory returned in a rush. Idaho, the ranch, Kenneth Murphy. She sat up, pushing her hair back from her face and looked around the room with fresh eyes. In daylight, she could see more details. The careful craftsmanship of the furniture, the colorful rag rug beside the bed, the way someone had taken care to make this space welcoming. Her carpetbag sat on a chair near the window, and she could see that her dress had been hung up to dry. She rose and went to the window, pulling aside the simple curtains to look out at her new home. The view took her breath away. The house sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills covered in pine and aspen, and she could see mountains in the distance, their peaks still white with snow despite the summer season. A creek ran through the property, the water clear and cold-looking, and beyond the immediate buildings she could see cattle grazing in fenced pastures. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that made her chest tight with emotion. A soft knock on the door pulled her attention away from the window. "Miss Hartley, I brought hot water for washing, and your dress is dry if you would like to come down for breakfast." Florence opened the door to find Kenneth standing in the hallway, holding a steaming pitcher. He had cleaned up since last night, his hair still damp from washing, wearing clean work clothes and looking somehow younger in the morning light. He kept his eyes carefully averted as he handed her the pitcher, and Florence was touched by his respect for her modesty. "Thank you. I will be down shortly." She washed quickly in the basin, grateful for the hot water and the bar of sweet-smelling soap someone had provided. Her dress was indeed dry, though wrinkled, and she did her best to smooth it out before putting it on. She braided her hair and pinned it up, checking her reflection in the small mirror over the dresser. She looked tired and there were shadows under her eyes, but she also looked determined, and that would have to be enough. Downstairs, Kenneth was at the stove, cooking bacon and eggs with the ease of someone who had been taking care of himself for a long time. The table was set for two, and fresh bread sat beside a crock of butter. Florence paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, and felt something warm unfold in her chest. This was domestic and real, and it was so far from her old life that she might as well have traveled to another world. "Sit," Kenneth said, noticing her. "I am not the best cook, but I can manage breakfast without poisoning anyone." Florence sat, accepting the plate he handed her. The food was simple but good, and they ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Kenneth spoke again. "I thought I could show you around the ranch today if you are up for it. Introduce you to the horses and cattle, show you the outbuildings. I want you to understand what life here looks like before you make any decisions." "I would like that," Florence said. "I want to understand what you do, how the ranch operates. If I am going to be a rancher's wife, I should know what that means." Kenneth smiled, that same transforming expression from the night before. "You might be surprised. It is not easy work and it is not always pleasant. But there is something satisfying about building something with your own hands, about taking care of land and animals." After breakfast, Kenneth found her a pair of boots that had belonged to Mrs. Patterson and a simple shawl to ward off the morning chill. They went outside together, and Florence breathed in the clean mountain air, feeling something inside her relax. This was what she had been searching for without quite knowing it. Space and freedom and the chance to be someone other than Boston Florence, the well-bred young woman who was expected to marry well and manage a household and never do anything interesting. Kenneth showed her the barn first, a solid structure that smelled of hay and animals and leather. The horses stuck their heads over their stall doors, curious about the visitor, and Kenneth introduced each one by name and personality. "This is Copper, my main riding horse. He is the one I rode last night, smart as they come and steady in any situation. And this," he said, moving to another stall, "is Grace. She is the mare I mentioned, the one that belonged to Thomas." Florence looked at the pretty chestnut mare with white socks on her front legs. She could see fresh stitches on Grace's shoulder and flank, angry-looking wounds that must have been painful. "How is she doing?" "Better than I had any right to hope. The cuts were deep but clean, and she did not fight me while I stitched her up. She is a tough girl." Kenneth reached out to stroke Grace's nose, and the horse leaned into his touch with obvious affection. "Thomas raised her from a foal. He always said she had the heart of a champion." "She is beautiful," Florence said honestly. Without quite thinking about it, she reached out her own hand, letting Grace sniff her before stroking the soft muzzle. The horse's breath was warm against her palm, and Florence felt a connection form, simple and pure. "I am glad you were able to save her." They moved through the rest of the barn, and Kenneth explained his breeding program, his plans for expanding the herd, the challenges of ranching in Idaho territory. Florence listened intently, asking questions when she did not understand something, and she could see Kenneth's surprise at her genuine interest. Perhaps he had expected her to be squeamish or bored, but Florence found herself fascinated by the intricacies of ranch management. "You have a good eye for this," Kenneth said as they walked toward the cattle pastures. "Most women from back east would not care about bloodlines and grazing rotation." "Most women from back east are not given the chance to care," Florence countered. "We are taught to manage households and servants, to plan menus and arrange flowers. But that does not mean we are not capable of understanding more complicated matters. My father ran a shipping business, and I used to sit in on his meetings before he decided I should focus on more ladylike pursuits." Kenneth gave her a long, assessing look. I think you might be exactly what this place needs." They spent the morning exploring the ranch, and Kenneth showed her everything from the chicken coop to the smokehouse to the root cellar where winter supplies were stored. He explained the seasonal rhythms of ranch life, the way spring meant calving and branding, summer meant haying and fence repair, fall meant preparing for winter, and winter meant simply surviving. It was harder work than Florence had imagined, more complicated and more precarious, but she found herself drawn to it in a way she had never been drawn to her old life. They stopped by the creek for a rest around midday, sitting on sun-warmed rocks while the water rushed past. Kenneth pulled bread and cheese from his pockets, along with 2 apples, and they shared an impromptu lunch in comfortable silence. "Can I ask you something?" Florence said eventually, watching the play of light on the water. "Anything. Why did you send for a mail-order bride? You are clearly capable of taking care of yourself, and you have built a successful ranch. You could have courted someone locally." Kenneth was quiet for a long moment, and Florence wondered if she had overstepped. But then he spoke, his voice thoughtful. "There are not many unmarried women in Idaho City, and the ones that are here have known me since I was a rough miner with more ambition than sense. They see me as I was, not as I am now. And truthfully, I wanted someone who would choose this life deliberately, who would come here knowing what they were getting into rather than someone who might resent leaving civilization behind." "That is honest," Florence said. "I figure we should be honest with each other. Seems like a good foundation for a marriage if that is what we decide to do." Kenneth looked at her, and Florence was struck again by his eyes, the way they seemed to see straight through to her core. "Your turn. Why did you answer my advertisement?" Florence considered how to explain the restlessness that had plagued her since her parents' deaths, the feeling that her life was being wasted on meaningless social obligations and empty conversations. "I wanted something real," she said finally. "Something that mattered. In Boston, my life was all surface and no substance. Every day was the same endless round of calls and teas and gatherings where everyone said the same things and pretended to care about the same meaningless topics. I wanted work that had purpose, a life that had meaning. Your letters suggested that I might find that here. And now that you are here, now that you have seen what that actually looks like," Florence met his gaze steadily. "I want to stay. I want to try this to see if we can build something together. I know we are strangers, and I know there are no guarantees, but I think this could work if we both wanted to." Something shifted in Kenneth's expression, a tension she had not quite noticed releasing. "I want it to work. I have been alone for too long, and this ranch feels empty with just me rattling around in it. I think we could be good partners, Florence Hartley. I think we could build something worth having. So we will try. We will try." Kenneth held out his hand, and Florence took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. They shook on it like business partners, but there was something more in the gesture, a promise of possibilities yet to unfold. They spent the afternoon working together, and Kenneth showed Florence how to feed the chickens, how to collect eggs, how to recognize which cattle were healthy and which might need attention. She was a quick study, and Kenneth found himself impressed by her willingness to learn and her lack of complaint about the dirty, unglamorous work. By the time evening rolled around, Florence's dress was dusty and her hands were dirty, but her eyes were bright with satisfaction. Kenneth cooked dinner, refusing Florence's offer to help with the excuse that she had done enough for her first day. They ate stew again, this time made from what Kenneth called his standard bachelor recipe, and it was not as good as Mrs. Patterson's, but it was hearty and filling. They talked easily now, the awkwardness of the previous night fading as they discovered shared opinions on everything from politics to literature to the best way to brew coffee. I did not expect you to be so well read, Florence admitted as Kenneth cleared the dishes. Your letters suggested you were educated, but I thought perhaps that was exaggeration. Thomas and I grew up in a mining camp, but our mother was determined we would not be ignorant. She taught us to read and write, made us study whenever we were not working. She died when I was 15, but by then the habit was set. I still read whenever I can, though out here that is not as often as I would like. Florence glanced around the main room and spotted a small bookshelf in one corner, filled with worn volumes. She went to examine them, running her fingers over the spines. History, poetry, novels, even a volume of Shakespeare. We have similar tastes, she said, pleased. I brought some books with me, though not as many as I would have liked. My carpet bag could only hold so much. We can order more from catalogs. Won't be quick, but eventually they arrive. That night, as Florence climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she felt a contentment she had not expected to find so quickly. Kenneth called good night from below, his voice warm in the darkness, and Florence responded in kind. She prepared for bed with a smile on her face, thinking about the day, about Kenneth's patience and intelligence, about the way he had looked at her when she successfully collected eggs without breaking a single one. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Kenneth continued sleeping on the couch downstairs, maintaining propriety while they got to know each other. Mrs. Patterson visited regularly, teaching Florence the skills she would need to manage a ranch household. Baking bread, preserving food, mending clothes, treating minor injuries in both humans and animals. She was a patient teacher, and Florence found herself grateful for the older woman's presence and guidance. Kenneth taught Florence to ride, starting with a gentle mare named Daisy and working up to more spirited horses as her confidence grew. She proved to be a natural horsewoman, with good hands and a fearless seat, and Kenneth found himself looking forward to their morning rides through the ranch. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for their future, opinions on the day-to-day decisions that came with running a ranch. 3 weeks after Florence's arrival, Kenneth suggested they ride up into the hills to check on some cattle that had wandered into the high pastures. They packed a lunch and set out early, following narrow trails through stands of pine and aspen. The day was perfect, warm but not hot, with a breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and sage. Florence felt utterly free in a way she had never experienced before, and she laughed out loud from pure joy. Kenneth looked over at her, and the expression on his face made Florence's breath catch. He was looking at her as though she was something precious, something miraculous, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. They found the cattle grazing contentedly in a meadow filled with lush grass and wildflowers. Kenneth counted them, checking for injuries or signs of illness, and declared himself satisfied. They ate lunch sitting in the shade of a massive pine, and the conversation turned more personal than it had been before. "I need to ask you something," Kenneth said, setting down his canteen. "And I want you to be completely honest with me." Florence felt her heart rate pick up, but she nodded. "All right. Are you happy here, not content or making the best of things, but actually happy? Because if you are not, if you are just enduring this for lack of better options, I need to know. I don't want you to feel trapped." Florence took a moment to consider her answer, wanting to be as honest as he had asked her to be. "I am happy," she said finally. "More than happy, actually. I feel like I have found something I did not even know I was looking for. This life, this place, it all feels right in a way nothing in Boston ever did." Kenneth's entire body seemed to relax. "Good. That is good. Because I have to tell you, Florence, somewhere in the past 3 weeks, I stopped thinking of you as my mail-order bride and started thinking of you as just mine. I know we agreed to take time, to get to know each other before making any permanent decisions, but I am already sure. I want to marry you properly, build a life with you, grow old on this ranch with you by my side. Florence's heart was pounding now, but it was excitement rather than fear. I want that too, she admitted. I think I have been half in love with you since you showed me Grace and I saw how gentle you were with her. And then every day after that just made it clearer. Yes, Kenneth. Yes to all of it. Kenneth moved closer slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Florence did not want to. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted the kiss that she could see in his eyes. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Florence's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms, and she kissed him back with all the feeling that had been building inside her. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Kenneth rested his forehead against hers. We should do this properly. I will talk to the Reverend in Idaho City, arrange for a real wedding. Mrs. Patterson will help you with a dress and we can invite the neighbors. I want everyone to know you are mine and I am yours. I would like that, Florence said, smiling. Though I do not need anything fancy. Just you and me and the promise we are making to each other. They rode back to the ranch in a state of joyful excitement, and Kenneth immediately set about making plans. The wedding was arranged for 3 weeks hence, giving Florence time to prepare and Kenneth time to make sure everything was perfect. Mrs. Patterson was thrilled when they shared the news, and she immediately began organizing the details with the efficiency of a military commander. Those 3 weeks were some of the happiest of Florence's life. She spent her days learning and working, her evenings talking with Kenneth by the fire, and her nights dreaming about their future. Kenneth remained a perfect gentleman, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but the tension between them was palpable, a promise of what would come once they were properly married. The day of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful. Mrs. Patterson had helped Florence make a simple dress from ivory cotton, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had belonged to Kenneth's mother. Florence wore her hair down, as Kenneth had shyly requested, with wildflowers woven through the dark strands. When she came down the stairs and saw Kenneth waiting at the bottom, looking handsome in a new suit with his hair neatly combed, she felt tears prick at her eyes. "You are beautiful," Kenneth said, his voice rough with emotion. "The most beautiful thing I have ever seen." The ceremony was held at the small church in Idaho City, with Mrs. Patterson and her husband standing as witnesses along with several other neighbors who had become friends over the past weeks. The Reverend, a kind-faced man named Reverend Brown, led them through traditional vows, and when Kenneth slipped a simple gold band onto Florence's finger, she felt as though her heart might burst from happiness. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Brown said with a smile. "You may kiss your bride." Kenneth pulled Florence into his arms and kissed her with a passion that made the small congregation chuckle. Florence kissed him back, not caring who was watching, wanting only to show him how much this meant to her, how grateful she was for the chance they had been given. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up on the lawn and food contributed by all the neighbors. There was music and dancing, and Florence found herself passed from partner to partner as various ranchers and miners wanted to welcome her properly. But her eyes kept returning to Kenneth, who watched her with a possessive pride that made her skin warm. As the sun began to set and the guests started to depart, Kenneth pulled Florence aside. "Are you ready to go inside, Mrs. Murphy?" Florence loved the sound of her new name. "Yes, yes, I am ready." They said good night to the last stragglers and went into the house together, And this time when they climbed the stairs, it was side by side, heading for the bedroom they would now share. Kenneth had moved his things in earlier, and Florence could see his brushes on the dresser next to hers, his boots by the door beside her shoes. It made the room feel complete in a way it had not before. Kenneth was gentle and patient, and Florence was grateful for his experience and consideration. There was awkwardness, as there always is in first times, but there was also tenderness and passion, and a connection that went deeper than the physical. When they finally lay together in the darkness, Florence's head on Kenneth's chest and his arm around her shoulders, she felt a peace she had never known existed. "I am glad the train brought you here," Kenneth said softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "I am glad you stood in the rain waiting for me. I am glad you did not give up and go back to Boston." "I am glad you came for me," Florence replied. "Even late, even soaking wet and covered in mud, you came and you never left." "I will never leave," Kenneth promised. "For as long as I live, Florence Murphy, I will be by your side." The seasons turned, and Florence learned the rhythms of ranch life. She worked alongside Kenneth during calving season, staying up all night when a difficult birth required extra hands. She learned to recognize the signs of illness in cattle and horses, to mend fences and bale hay, to shoot a rifle well enough to protect the livestock from predators. She baked bread and preserved vegetables, kept the house clean and warm, tended the chickens and the garden she planted that first spring. But she was not just a helpmate. Kenneth valued her opinions and included her in decisions about the ranch's future. They bought more land, expanded the herd, improved the breeding stock. When Kenneth was laid up for 2 weeks with a broken leg after a horse threw him, Florence ran the ranch with Mrs. Patterson's help, making decisions and solving problems without waiting for permission. Kenneth was impressed and proud, and he told everyone who would listen that he had married a woman who was his true partner in every sense of the word. 2 years after their wedding, Florence discovered she was pregnant. She told Kenneth over breakfast, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, and then a smile spread across his face so wide and joyful that Florence started laughing. "A baby," Kenneth said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby," Florence confirmed, and then she was in his arms, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. The pregnancy was not easy. Florence suffered from sickness in the early months and exhaustion in the later ones, but she refused to slow down too much. Kenneth worried constantly, trying to make her rest, but Florence was stubborn. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she told him. "I am strong and I am healthy and everything will be fine." Mrs. Patterson came to stay with them a month before the baby was due, and her presence was a comfort to both Florence and Kenneth. When Florence's labor started on a cold November night, Mrs. Patterson took charge with calm efficiency while Kenneth paced downstairs, feeling more helpless than he had since he was a boy in the mining camps. The baby was born just after dawn, a healthy boy with a lusty cry and a shock of dark hair. Florence was exhausted but triumphant, and when Kenneth was finally allowed upstairs and saw his son for the first time, he wept openly. "He is perfect," Kenneth said, touching the tiny fingers with reverent gentleness. "You are perfect. Florence, thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas Kenneth Murphy, after Kenneth's brother and father, and he became the center of their world. Florence discovered that she loved being a mother, and Kenneth was a devoted father, doting on his son with a tenderness that made Florence fall in love with him all over again. Thomas was 18 months old when Florence became pregnant again, and this time she was less worried, more confident in her body's ability to do what it was meant to do. Their daughter, Anne Elizabeth Murphy, was born on a spring morning with the windows open and birdsong filling the air. She was smaller than Thomas had been, with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn chin. The ranch continued to prosper. Kenneth's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher grew, and they began selling cattle and horses throughout the Idaho Territory and beyond. Money was still sometimes tight, but they were building something solid, something that would last beyond their own lifetimes. They added rooms to the house, built a new barn, dug a proper well. Other families moved into the area, drawn by stories of good land and opportunity, and Idaho City grew from a rough mining town into a real community. Florence became active in the church and the school, serving on committees and organizing social events. She was respected and liked, known for her competence and her kindness, and she counted herself fortunate in her friendships. Mrs. Patterson remained a constant presence in their lives, a beloved honorary grandmother to Thomas and Anne. She taught Florence skills she had not even known existed, shared wisdom earned through decades of frontier living, and was always available with a sympathetic ear or a practical solution when problems arose. Kenneth's ranch became known as one of the best in the territory, and other ranchers sought his advice on breeding and management. He took on apprentices, young men who wanted to learn the trade, and he was known as a fair but demanding teacher. Thomas followed his father everywhere as soon as he was old enough to walk, and Kenneth began teaching him about horses and cattle and land stewardship. Anne was different from her brother, more interested in books and music than in animals and outdoor work, and Florence made sure her daughter had access to education and culture. They ordered books and instruments, and Florence taught Anne to read and play the piano that Kenneth had shipped from San Francisco as a surprise gift. Kenneth loved both his children deeply, but differently, recognizing that they were individuals with their own interests and talents. 7 years after Anne's birth, Florence had another son, Samuel Patrick Murphy, and then 3 years later a daughter, Mary Catherine Murphy. The house was full of noise and laughter and chaos, and Florence and Kenneth would not have changed it for anything. They had built something rare and precious, a family bound by love and respect, a home that was a refuge from the hardness of frontier life, a partnership that only grew stronger with each passing year. Thomas grew into a tall, serious young man with his father's gift for handling horses and his mother's quick intelligence. At 20, he took over more of the ranch's day-to-day operations, allowing Kenneth to slow down slightly as age began to catch up with him. Anne married a schoolteacher from Boise and moved there, though she visited often with her growing family. Samuel proved to have a head for business and began managing the financial side of the ranch, making investments that expanded their prosperity. Mary, the youngest, inherited her mother's stubborn independence and announced at 16 that she intended to become a doctor, a goal both Florence and Kenneth supported despite the raised eyebrows of their neighbors. As Florence and Kenneth entered their 50s, they began to reflect on the life they had built together. The ranch was thriving, their children were happy and successful, and they had grandchildren who filled the house with joy whenever they visited. Kenneth's hair had gone gray, and Florence had laugh lines around her eyes, but they were healthy and content and still deeply in love. "You ever regret it?" Kenneth asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Leaving Boston, marrying a stranger, building this life." Florence took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Not for 1 second. This life, this family, it is everything I ever wanted and more than I ever dreamed possible. That night I stood in the rain at the station was the best thing that ever happened to me. Even though I was late." "Even though you were late," Florence smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. You came for me, Kenneth Murphy, and you never left. That is all that matters. Kenneth kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. I will never leave, not in this life or the next. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the land they had built a life on spread out before them. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear the sounds of family. Thomas discussing plans for next season with Samuel, Mary practicing her medical terminology, the laughter of grandchildren visiting for the summer. It was everything they had worked for, everything they had dreamed of, and it was real in a way that still sometimes took Florence's breath away. Years passed, and the Murphy Ranch became a landmark in Idaho Territory. Then Idaho State, after 1890, brought statehood. Kenneth and Florence watched as the frontier they had known changed and grew, as railways connected remote communities and electricity came to even rural areas. They adapted as they always had, embracing useful changes while holding on to the values that had guided them from the beginning. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw a large celebration at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, and there was food and music and dancing just as there had been at their wedding. Kenneth gave a speech, his voice still strong despite his 70 years, thanking everyone for their friendship and support over the decades. But mostly he talked about Florence, about the woman who had come west on faith and courage, who had built a life and a family with him, who had been his partner and his love through everything life had thrown at them. I was late meeting her that first day, Kenneth said, his eyes finding Florence in the crowd. Left her standing in the rain at the Idaho City station, and it is a wonder she did not take the next train back east. But she stayed, and she gave me a chance, and I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of that chance. I love you, Florence Murphy, more today than I did 40 years ago, and I will love you for whatever time we have left and beyond. Florence made her way to his side, tears streaming down her face, and kissed him in front of everyone while their children and grandchildren cheered. It was not as passionate as their first kiss, but it was deeper, richer, full of 4 decades of shared experiences and unwavering commitment. They had many more good years together. Florence lived to see Mary graduate from medical school, one of the few women doctors in the state. She held great-grandchildren and taught them to bake bread and tend gardens and stand up for themselves. She watched as Thomas's son took over the ranch and continued the legacy they had built. She remained active and engaged until her 81st year, when she caught pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Kenneth nursed her with the same gentle care he had shown to his brother's horse all those years ago, sitting by her bedside and holding her hand through the fever and the chills. When she was lucid, they talked about their life together, about the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren they had raised, about the ranch and the land and the community they had helped build. I am not afraid, Florence told Kenneth one night when the fever had broken, but they both knew recovery was unlikely. I have lived a full life, a good life. The only regret I have is leaving you. Don't talk like that, Kenneth said, but his voice broke on the words. You are going to be fine. You have to be fine. I cannot do this without you. Florence squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. You are strong, Kenneth Murphy, the strongest man I have ever known. You will grieve, and that is right, but then you will go on. For our children, for our grandchildren, for the ranch, promise me you will go on. I promise, Kenneth whispered, knowing it was the last promise he could make to her, the last gift he could give. I promise I will go on. Florence died 3 days later, surrounded by her family, with Kenneth holding her hand and whispering words of love. She slipped away peacefully in the early morning, as the sun was rising over the mountains she had come to love so deeply. Kenneth kept his promise. He grieved deeply and honestly, but he continued living, continued working, continued being a father and grandfather and great-grandfather. He told stories about Florence to anyone who would listen, keeping her memory alive in the hearts of those who had known her and those who had not. He lived another 5 years, remaining active on the ranch almost until the end. And when his heart finally gave out on a clear summer day, his family knew that he had gone to find Florence. They buried Kenneth next to Florence in the small cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch. Their graves were marked with simple stones that bore their names, dates, and a single line Kenneth had requested. He came for her and never left. The ranch continued under Thomas's capable management, then passed to his son, and so on through the generations. The Murphy family remained pillars of the community, known for their integrity and their commitment to the land. The house was expanded and modernized over the years, but the original structure remained, a reminder of the couple who had built it and the love story that had started with a late arrival at a train station. In the main room of the house, in a place of honor above the stone fireplace, hung 2 items: Kenneth's original advertisement for a mail-order bride, yellowed with age and framed behind glass, and Florence's crumpled letter accepting his proposal, carefully restored and preserved. Beside them was a photograph taken on their 40th anniversary, showing an older couple still holding hands, still looking at each other with the same devotion they had felt as newlyweds. And sometimes, on rainy evenings when the wind howled down from the mountains, people claimed they could see 2 figures on the front porch, standing close together, watching over the land and the family they had built. Whether it was imagination or something more, it comforted those who saw it, a reminder that true love does not end with death, but continues on, eternal and unchanging as the mountains themselves. The story of Kenneth and Florence Murphy became part of local legend, told and retold through the generations. It was a story about second chances and keeping promises, about courage and commitment, about building something lasting from the most uncertain of beginnings. It was a story about a woman who stood in the rain waiting for her future, and a man who came late but stayed forever. And it was, above all, a love story. Not the simple, easy kind of love that burns bright and fast, but the deep, enduring kind that grows stronger with each shared challenge, each overcome obstacle, each quiet moment of connection. It was the kind of love that built ranches and raised families and changed a wild frontier into a thriving community. It was the kind of love that people still dreamed about, still hoped to find for themselves. The Murphy Ranch stood as a testament to that love, its fences strong, its pastures green, its barns well maintained. 6 generations after Kenneth and Florence first rode up to its door together, the ranch still prospered, still welcomed family home for holidays and celebrations, still served as a gathering place for the community. And somewhere in the house, in a box of carefully preserved letters, were the words that had started it all. A lonely rancher's honest advertisement, and a brave woman's reply that changed both their lives forever. The rain that had drenched Florence on that first night became part of the family mythology, a symbol of washing away the past and beginning anew. When storms rolled through the valley, bringing needed rain to the crops and grass, the Murphy descendants would look out their windows and think of their ancestors, of the woman who had stood alone in the storm and the man who had ridden through it to reach her. They would remember that the best things in life often begin in the most unpromising circumstances, that love can grow from the smallest seeds of hope and faith, that promises kept are worth more than promises made. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, as the world changed in ways Kenneth and Florence could never have imagined, the Murphy Ranch remained, an anchor of stability and tradition. The original house was now a historical landmark, preserved and maintained by the family, open to visitors who wanted to see how the pioneers had lived. Tour guides told the story of Kenneth and Florence, and people listened with rapt attention, hungry for tales of romance and adventure in an age that often seemed to lack both. Young couples getting married would sometimes visit the ranch, standing where Kenneth and Florence had stood, making their own promises to each other, hoping to capture some of that enduring love for themselves. The Murphy family welcomed them, recognizing that the story of their ancestors belonged not just to the family, but to everyone who believed in the power of love and commitment. And on the anniversary of Kenneth and Florence's wedding each year, the Murphy family would gather at the ranch for a celebration. They would share a meal and tell stories, would visit the graves on the hill and leave flowers, would remind themselves of where they came from and what values they carried forward. The youngest children would hear for the first time how their many times great-grandmother had traveled across the country to marry a stranger, and how she had stood in the rain at the station waiting for him. They would hear how their many times great-grandfather had been late, but how he had come and never left. They would learn that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made again and again through all the seasons of life. And as the sun set over the Idaho mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, the Murphy family would raise their glasses in a toast to Kenneth and Florence, to the love that had started it all, to the legacy they had left behind. They would drink to second chances and kept promises, to courage in the face of uncertainty, to the kind of love that lasts beyond a single lifetime and echoes through the generations. The story of the mail-order bride who was left at the station in the rain, and the cowboy who arrived late and never left, was more than just a family history. It was a reminder that the greatest adventures often begin with a leap of faith, that the most lasting love is built on mutual respect and shared work, that being late to something does not mean you have missed your chance. It was a story that insisted on happy endings while acknowledging the hard work required to achieve them. A story that celebrated both romance and partnership, passion and patience. Kenneth and Florence Murphy had taken a gamble on each other, on a future they could not see, and a life they could not imagine. They had worked hard, loved deeply, and built something that outlasted them both. Their story was proof that it was possible to find your person, your place, your purpose, even in the most unexpected circumstances. It was proof that being left in the rain was not the end of the story, but sometimes just the beginning. And so the Murphy Ranch remained, generation after generation, a living monument to a love that had started with letters and hope, that had survived that disastrous first meeting, that had grown stronger with each passing year. The land itself seemed to remember, the creek singing the same song it had sung when Kenneth and Florence first rode past it together, the mountains standing watch as they always had, the house holding memories in every timber and stone. In the end, what Kenneth and Florence had built was more than a successful ranch or a large family. What they had built was a legacy of love, of showing up for each other day after day, of choosing commitment over convenience, of finding joy in shared work and shared life. They had shown that it was possible to take the fragments of hope and faith that brought them together and forge them into something unbreakable, something that would shine as an example for everyone who came after. The story ended where it began, At a train station, where a woman once stood alone in the rain and a man rode through the storm to reach her. But it was not really an ending at all. It was a continuation, a thread running through time, connecting past to present and present to future. As long as there were Murphy descendants to tell the tale, as long as there were people who believed in the possibility of finding true love in unexpected places, the story of Kenneth and Florence Murphy would live on. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy of all. Not the ranch or the land or even the family, but the story itself. The reminder that love could be found, that promises could be kept, that a life built together was worth more than any life lived alone. Kenneth had come for Florence that rainy night, and he had never left. It was a simple truth, but it contained everything that mattered: loyalty, devotion, commitment, and a love that conquered every obstacle in its path. The Murphy Ranch still stood under the Idaho sky, and it would stand for generations more, a testament to what two people could build when they chose love and work and each other, day after day, year after year, through all the seasons of their lives. The rain had fallen, the cowboy had come, and they had created something that would last forever.